for inviting us. We're really happy to be here.
Absolutely.
I'm Neil McCutcheon, and I run a training centre called ELTeach, and we do CELTA courses and also pre-CELTA, LA, and post-CELTA courses.
And I'm Neil Anderson, and I work in Budapest in Hungary, Tibor's home country, where I'm a settled permanent resident. I work at Euroexam International, the head of their training there, Budapest Training Institute.
The purpose of the talk is twofold today. First, to introduce TBL or TBLT to people who don't know it, and then to show you something called Jamboard that you may or may not have seen, and show you how you can use that online tool to facilitate tasks. Just a little bit of background. So Neil and I met at International House in Budapest, and we were teacher trainers there and worked on the DELTA course. And those of you who are doing DELTA, you'll have come across task-based learning, I'm sure. And we felt that although Cutting Edge is quite a task-based book, in general, there was a kind of lack of go-to material for teachers. And that's why we decided to work on our book in 2019. And then just like everybody in the pandemic, we had a lot of time on our hands. And so we started the Fluency First blog with online tasks for teachers. Okay, so we're going to talk through some of the benefits of task-based learning and then go into Jamboard. And first thing, I'll just say that TBL, we've taken that from the 1990s, from the Willises, but TBL and TBLT are exactly the same thing: task-based learning, task-based language teaching. There isn't any difference there.
Yeah, we're just resistant to change, basically.
We grew up with it, you know.
Yes.
What is task-based learning and why is it good? I know that you'll be at different levels, and some of you will be very familiar with this. So if you are, bear with me, there'll be a lot of revision here. So first of all, we're all in the business of communicative language teaching, and task-based learning is a communicative framework. It puts the task, which you might think of as the freer practice stage of lessons, if you're doing CELTA, rather than sort of shuffling that along to the end of the lesson, it puts it really center stage, and it's really the centerpiece of the lesson. Task-based learning is supported by second language acquisition theory. It's probably the most researched method. And there are a lot of experts who support task-based learning, like Rod Ellis and the late Mike Long. One of the things that task-based learning does is that it helps to enlist the unconscious processes of second language acquisition. So the explicit teaching is part of the lesson, but it's not the most important part. There's a lot of opportunity for incidental learning, which is when students are learning, but not necessarily what you're teaching. Teaching is an untidy business, and task-based learning takes note of that. Lessons are student-centered because a lot of the language is emergent language. It's coming from the students, and the teacher's job is kind of to capture the language at the point of need. Tasks can be authentic. They can mimic real life situations if you're teaching ESP or business English, or they can be sort of interactionally authentic so that the interactions can be a little bit like real life situations. The focus on form, that's what F on F means. That's the explicit language focus. That tends to come late in the lesson, as we'll see soon. And with task-based learning, it's richer. This is richer and more diverse than perhaps you're used to if you teach PPP sort of course book style lessons. So instead of taking one structure a day, what Scott Thornbury famously referred to as grammar McNuggets, you can range very widely and take some aspects of pronunciation and some lexis and some grammar and functional language, chunks of language, depending on what you feel the students need in order to accomplish the task. And finally, task-based lessons, the task gets repeated, and research has shown that that's good for accuracy, for complexity of students' language when they get another go at doing something. And also, of course, it's very good for fluency. By the way, just want to say we're not evangelists for task-based learning. We just think it's one effective method. We're not saying that this is the only way to teach or anything like that. It's just something worth trying out with your students.
Yeah, we've been described as pragmatists, which I think was a compliment, but it means we're just encouraging teachers to add it as a tool to their toolkit rather than thinking it's the way to teach. Why not do some task-based lessons if you can?
Absolutely. So a couple of quotations here. Firstly, from the late Dave Willis, who the Willis has brought task-based learning into our style of ELT. And this is about, I'll just let you read it. This is about the teacher letting go of the control and admitting that we can't really control the process of students learning, much as we might like to. And then one more quotation again from Dave Willis. I think this sums up task-based learning perfectly. So it's the need to communicate that makes the language relevant for students and drives the acquisition of specific language forms. Okay, over to you, Neil.
Yeah, I mean, at this point, you may be wondering, okay, that's all well and good, but what exactly is a task? And that's clearly a central question. The first thing I want to say is that task-based learning, TBL, TBLT, is a broad church. In other words, there are deeper end versions of it, shallower end versions of it. At the deeper end, you might have someone like Mike Long that Neil mentioned before, who believes that syllabuses should be based upon needs analysis, and the needs analysis identifies the specific real life, real world needs of learners, and the course is built around that, their professional, their everyday needs. And then there are others, including ourselves, who think that tasks don't have to precisely reflect what we do in everyday life. It should just be something that is authentic to everyday discourse. So discussions, negotiations, agreeing, disagreeing, problem solving. These are the kind of things that I think characterize our approach to task-based learning and fit quite tidily with mainstream teaching. But all of the experts agree that tasks have certain characteristics, and this is what differentiate them from many of the exercises that you might find in a course book. First of all, as you can see on the slide, tasks focus on meaning, not form, as their primary driver, essentially. So tasks aren't about getting students to display that they can use a particular form of language, a particular structure, for instance. Rather, they're using all the language at their disposal, and in doing so, they are making meaning or creating meaning. So this is the student's own linguistic resources. It's not about what the teacher tells them to do. Use this structure, use that structure. It's about learners being able to use whatever they can in order to do something with language, in order to create meaning. And this creation of meaning is usually about achieving a goal or an outcome. For instance, They might need to agree on 5 things in groups. They might need to solve a problem. They might need to share and compare life experiences. These are, I hope, or I think, the kind of things that we do in our lessons all the time. Really, what differentiates task-based learning is that it centers that as the main unit of a lesson. And these tasks that I mentioned, there's usually some form of gap. So there's a need to communicate. There's a need for learners to share information. And we often refer to these as either opinion gaps. Students have different opinions. They don't necessarily know what their interlocutor's opinion is, or students have different sets of information that they need to share to achieve something, and so on. So let's look at an example to make it a little bit more concrete. In fact, 2 examples, 2 things, one of which is more task-like based on the criteria I've just mentioned, and one of which is less task-like. And there's no implied criticism of the one that's less task-like. I'm just simply saying by virtue of the criteria, it doesn't fulfill what's necessary for it to be a task. So A is the first one. Talk to your partners about the weekend, use be going to. What about B, Neil? Okay, so plan a weekend, things you've never done in Budapest or wherever you are. It's obviously just an example, and present this to the class and decide whose weekend you would like to join. Now, if you feel like it, just throw into the chat quickly, A or B, which one seems to fulfill the criteria of a task more, A or B? Yeah, I can see, no surprise, I can see a few Bs here. And the reason is because the first one is clearly the incentive to do it, or the goal is about display of language, use be going to. There is no sort of, the goal isn't focused on co-creating something meaningful, unlike in the second, where they have to decide, they have to create the weekend and then decide whose weekend is best, using all of the language at their disposal, which could include be going to, but as Neil mentioned earlier, it could be richer. There could be other language that emerges that they hear that you as the teacher can deal with, and so on and so forth. There are many different ways to categorize tasks. Here are some categories that we could use. Tasks can be very simple. One thing we often get asked is, well, you can't really do them with lower levels, can you? And that's a complex question, and we're going to answer it, not in this session, but in our next book, plug. One type of task that I think is very usable at all levels is simply listing. Get students to agree on things together, create a list of something. So there's an example there, and slightly more cognitively complex, rank things. Problem solving, for instance, you've got a certain amount of money, how are you going to spend it? Agree together on how you will allocate this budget in a certain context. As I mentioned, there are opinion gaps. So here's a task we'll see a little bit later. So show off your country's cuisine, agree with each other. What are the best dishes from your country, for instance? Information gap I already mentioned as well. Now, in this case, students have different batches of information. For instance, they've got different news stories and they share them with each other. They can't see each other's, but they communicate, share them, and decide which one is fake news. For example, sharing experiences. I think this is every bit a task as anything else. Talking about things from your life, finding out more about your partners. For instance, holidays from childhood. And there are a whole raft of creative tasks you can engage with as well. One from our book is called Soundtracks, and that involves students listening to a piece of music, something instrumental streamed from YouTube, and they've got certain prompts, and based upon those prompts, they have to agree on and create a movie, basically, you know, the characters, the plot, and so on and so forth. So that's, again, engaging with meaning. They're collaborating to do something with language, not just to use a particular language point.
And I'll just add an obvious point that they're all fun. Yeah. So, you know, the idea of having more fun in your lesson. And if they don't seem fun, well, the whole point is tailor them so they're fun for your students. Tweak the context, make it relevant to your students.
whether they're young learners, business English learners, and so on and so forth.
So here's one example of the task cycle. This is slightly simplified from the one by the Willises again. There are 3 broad stages to a task-based lesson, and nearly always, because these are important stages, but people manage the stages in different ways. It's not a monolithic approach. These are just the kind of things you can do in each stage. So the pre-task phase will be familiar to all of you, I think, as the lead into your lesson, when you're activating schemata, getting into the topic, getting students interested in whichever way, and perhaps pre-teaching any vocabulary that's essential, just the way you would in a skills lesson, perhaps. You can also use texts at this stage, authentic texts, or Neil's going to show you an AI generated text later. It's a good time to look at the lexical richness of text to get them into the topic. And also, one thing that you can do at this stage or later on is play them a model, so a recording, a video or an audio of someone doing the task. And we've got some models both in our book and online of people unscripted, or yes, completely unscripted, actually, just saying what they're just doing the task, literally. So that can be good as well. You'll see the model is also possible to do in the final stage. So the centerpiece of the lesson, as I said, is the task. This is students communicating with each other, and they will focus primarily on meaning, as Neil said, but they're also going to focus on language forms as they do the task, because if they don't understand each other, they're going to have to negotiate for meaning. You know, somebody's going to frown and say, what do you mean? And they'll have to re-explain. So the students are going to do that on their own. The Willises thought that teachers should just leave them alone to get on with that. And Mike Long is more a favor of teachers intervening. There's no hard and fast rule. I think it's a good time actually to do a sort of light touch intervention there as the students are doing the task. Yeah. Definitely monitor the task, as you all do. And then the report stage can be a more formal stage where the students produce a piece of writing based on what they've done, and that will lead to emergent language. Or we simplified that and just thought, why not just do content feedback on the task? Again, if you focus on the content, the emergent language is going to take care of itself. Here's the language focus now. So based on that and linking from the previous stage, now you can look at language. Sometimes in a so-called focus task, you've already planned that. Here's some language I knew would come up and I prepared earlier, right? That's easy to do. You can do your usual sort of clarification then, but using language that you've drawn from the students, or you can create a so-called consciousness raising worksheet that Neil will show you later. Notice how the language focus comes late in a task-based lesson. It's not the main part of the lesson at all. Secondary, it's supporting the task. And then typically what you would do after that, if you have time, is repeat the task with all the benefits of task repetition, and students can, if they want, use some of the language that you've introduced, but they don't have to because that's not the aim of the lesson. So there you have a typical task-based lesson, and you can think how that differs from a course book style lesson.
Yeah, I mean, I can't remember, I think it was Jane Willis who talks about it being PPP upside down, which is a bit of a simplification, but it might help sort of get a sense of it. Fluency first, accuracy is later. Yeah.
Fluency to accuracy rather than accuracy,
not accuracy
to
fluency.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. So I'd like to just place this task cycle online and how we've been doing our task-based lessons online and how that's reflected in our blog and how you might use very simple, very common tools because you're talking to someone who's not particularly tech savvy. That's me, or you're listening to someone who's not very tech savvy. And actually, you can see that transition in our blog as well. You know, as we started to get to grips with certain tools and later tasks, we start using more of them. But there are certain key tools, I think, that are simple and effective for facilitating task-based lessons online. And you can see the symbols there in the top left. Of course, it's Jamboard, and we'll look at an example shortly. But in a nutshell, I'm sure you do know it, but for anyone who doesn't, it's essentially a kind of interactive whiteboard. It's part of Google's suite. So the advantage of it is that students can be working on it when they're in breakout rooms, which we can also see on the top right there. And they can be collaborating on this interactive whiteboard, moving around sticky notes, pictures, brainstorming, and so on and so forth. So it's a great mediator for the task. And also it can be used to prepare students for the task as well. Now, I mentioned breakout rooms. It's essential in this kind of methodology to create space for learners to communicate. They are supposed to be operating and working fairly independently, at least in the main task phase, if not other phases. And of course, that necessitates the teacher taking a step back. So having some form of online tool, such as Zoom, in which there are effective breakout rooms, is pretty essential, to my mind, for task-based learning. Okay. In addition to Jamboard, we can see in the bottom left just simply Google Docs. So if you have a task that involves a lot of text, either the students need to read it or they're producing it, because tasks can be written as well as spoken. They could be creating some form of text together. Then Google Docs is obviously ideal, because just like Jamboard, it's going to operate in the background of the breakout room, and they can work on it together, and the teacher can monitor it and provide feedback in the form of comments or gather data for later. But it's really very, very effective, especially for tasks that involve a lot of writing rather than speaking, because again, it encourages independent collaboration, independent from the teacher, but students working together. And in addition to that, the language focus, so the sort of language feedback phase at the end, I'll show you shortly an example of a template I use in Google Docs for giving feedback on emergent language. But of course, you could simply use the chat function as well. So long as you've been paying attention, making notes of language that seems interesting or problematic, and then sharing it in the chat or sharing it in Google Docs for post-task reflection and analysis. So these are some of the things that, some of the key tools that we use essentially, but let's make it more concrete. So
yes, so that's the structure, and then we're going to show you two tasks now, one of which is in the book, and we're going to show you how to use Jamboard. Let me just close this. Neil, have you got a Jamboard?
Yeah, just give me just a second. Okay, so I'll share the Jamboard for the first task, which is domestic robot, right?
Yeah. So while we're setting up, oh, here it comes. Okay, can everybody see that? Lizzie, can you see the Jamboard?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
All right, that's great. Okay, so you may know this task already. I heard about it from a blog or something about a Jeremy Harmer presentation. So I think it probably goes back even beyond Jeremy Harmer. So I won't take credit.
Old classic.
It's an old classic, and it's a kind of pyramid discussion. I first came across a pyramid discussion in the Klippel book, Keep Talking, if you know that that book, the NASA task. You may have done it.
Wonderful book.
Yeah. So here's a version. So this is the introductory slide on Jamboard. By the way, pyramid discussions work really well in person in face-to-face classrooms, but they also work online. And here's how to do that. So here's my flat. and it's very clean. And why do you think it's so clean? Do you think I like doing the cleaning? And the students will say no, and I can show them this picture. What's that? It's a domestic robot. Okay, so it's an AI that's programmed to do simple tasks around the house. Okay. While I'm describing the task, you can think about the two questions at the bottom. Okay, is it communicative, and what kind of language could you feed in, which we're going to start now. So just so that you can see how it works, Neil, can you share the link in the chat?
Sure.
I don't want everyone to rush at once, but I'll get some of you involved.
I think there's only a limited number of people who can come into. I can't remember what the maximum is for Jamboard anyway, but you go ahead and give the.
Yeah.
Okay,
so
I've put the link in the chat. Yeah.
Okay, so if you click on the link, you'll be able to do certain things on the Jamboard. So can I get just the people who were born in January and February? Can you have a look on the left-hand side, and you'll see a little menu. Can you see the sticky note? It's the, Neil's showing you it now. It's the fourth one down. So what I'd like you to do on that board is, if your birthday is in January or February, can you just write on a sticky note one domestic chore that you don't like doing? So something that you would like the domestic robot to do. For example, here they come. I'll give you a minute or so to write.
One thing you'll notice that, especially if you've got a lot of students doing this, is that these sticky notes can end up piling on top of each other. So students need to know how to move them around as well.
Yeah. So great. Got a lot of good ideas there. Vacuuming, correctly spelled, cleaning, making the beds, and so on. So the idea is to, wow, scraping the mold off shower walls. Yes.
So someone's gonna be putting grouting in there in a minute.
God, I love these. So this is the start of the vocabulary, isn't it? This is vocabulary that students are going to need in order to do the task. Now, and obviously you clarified that. Now, Neil, can you just show them that, everybody look very carefully, there's a tiny, tiny little arrow at the top, which is absolutely essential. So when Neil clicks this, you'll see something magical about Jamboard.
Okay, I'm going to stop everyone from writing stuff. Can I just show you how to do that? So this is just a typical Google share options. We've got anyone with the link can be an editor right now, and you need to make sure you do that if you want your students to contribute to the Jamboard. But there may be times when you don't want them to contribute, you just want them to look, in which case you switch it to viewer. Okay, done. So I think now you can no longer add any more fantastic ideas. My apologies for that. A bit of a slightly dictatorial.
Control, yes. So now Neil's going to show you something at the top. If are you able to show that, Neil?
Yes.
There. So it's very tiny. It's that little V sign, very important. So when you open that, you can duplicate your Jamboard, all the pictures, anything that's on it, you can duplicate it so you can see. And Neil's just duplicated that one. And if you move along to frame 3, 4, and 5.
I'm just going to delete these now. That's how you duplicate and delete them if you want to.
So it's one click and you can duplicate the room. So if you look here, we've got room 1 and it's ready to go, a Jamboard for room 1. And then Neil, if you show them room 2 as well. There you are, it's identical. So everybody's got the link, everybody can contribute, and then you're going to put them into the rooms. And here's the task. You can install 5 apps on your domestic robot. So go into the room, give them a time limit, choose the apps that you want. You only get the apps you choose. So if you only choose 2, you only get 2, right? So if you want 5, choose 5, and you've got 3 minutes. And they're all going to discuss. Okay, now if you move it along a couple of frames, Neil, Thank you. So when they come out, you might choose to do some discussion in the main room, but in general, don't do too much because we're going to move on to the second phase now. Right, so I've prepared another Jamboard, rooms 1 and 2, and then rooms 3 and 4. I won't be putting you in rooms right now. There isn't time, but you'll put the students into rooms when you do this. So it's very easy to do on Zoom to combine the people in those rooms. So you just say, okay, now if you're in room 1, that's the previous room 1 and 2 together. Now if you're in room 3, that's the previous room 3 and 4. And because of government cutbacks, you only get 3 apps installed on the domestic robot, and you have to agree which 3 apps you want, and you only get the ones that you choose. So if you've only got 2, you only get 2. If you want 3, get those 3, and again, give them a time limit. So they have to discuss. Okay, and meanwhile you can monitor. And then back to the main room, you can choose somebody to report back. I think it's often useful to nominate that person in advance, or tell them you're going to report back, choose a spokesperson. So they can report back to the whole class in the main room, tell them which are the 3 chores that they hate most. And then if you want, you can vote as a class. So we have to share the domestic robot with everybody in the block now, everybody. We only get to choose 3. Which 3 are we going to vote for? And that's the pyramid nature of the discussion. So it starts from the individuals, then cooperating in rooms, then in larger groups, and eventually finishing with the whole class. We already fed in the part about chores, and here's some other language that could come up. If you can think of anything else, you can just put it in the chat now. What language might arise from that task? Like, hate, dislike, intermediate level, some slightly higher level language, waste of time, time consuming, and so on. So things to do with choice. Also the kind of interactions like it's your turn, or what do you think, or I disagree. Comparatives, obviously comparing that's more difficult or that's worse than. So this is the kind of language you might focus on after the task. And obviously it's communicative because they have to listen to each other, because they have to reach a decision. There's a couple of good questions in the chat. I'll just choose one here. One link to Jamboard. Students have to, this is Kathleen, one link to Jamboard, students have to go to the page that is labeled for their room. Exactly. So you only need one link, and you've got to obviously check those instructions before you send the students down to the breakout rooms. Check that they know where they're going and which Jamboard they're going to be, graffitiing over.
Jamboard, like any tool that you use with students for the first time, it takes a little bit of training, so ease them in. And as Neil says, give very, very clear instructions. But if you haven't used it, you'd be very surprised at how quickly it becomes completely intuitive to use. Yeah,
very easy to make these Jamboards. It takes minutes.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, I was just admiring earlier that someone said paint my chicken coop. That's one I haven't seen, but in terms of domestic chores, the most popular is almost always, as in most popular, as in the most hated. I don't know if anyone can guess. All of my students, in the end, they always go for doing the dusting. I don't know whether that's because we live in a dusty city, but that's the thing that they hate the most.
It's one that I never do.
Yeah, well, no comment. Okay, I'd like to show you very, very quickly another task, which I call the National Banquet. And this is obviously geared towards Hungarian students, but that's naturally is completely adaptable to wherever you are. So the context for the task, which you're establishing in the pre-task phase, is that a guest is coming to your country, and you're going to present a banquet which really shows off the best of the cuisine of your country. And students on their own choose certain items like 3 starters, 3 main courses, 3 desserts, 3 choices of drink, and they have to think of this before they move on to the main task. And notice how I'm using the Jamboard frame here to really clearly lay out the instructions. Students can double check it. One of the issues with teaching online is that instructions get lost very easily. So visual support for instructions is hugely important, in my opinion, and Jamboard can facilitate that. And the main task itself, they're going to get into groups, present their ideas for their feast, their banquet to their partners. And then, so if they're in groups of 3, they'll have potentially 9 starters, 9 main courses, 9 desserts, and they have to negotiate, agree together, okay, what is going to be the finest banquet we can present to this visitor to our country? You know, what is going to be the most Hungarian banquet in this case? And it works in a wonderful way for multilingual classes too, when they're shared, because there's an information gap there too, where they're sharing different dishes with each other and then agreeing what to add and what not to. And so for the main task itself, as we said, Jamboard mediates or facilitates tasks. So they each group has this, as you can see here, it's room 1. Again, I've labeled it room 1. Each group has its template, and we've got the different courses or dishes here, or whatever it is that you want them to do as a task to brainstorm. And they sit, talk, agree together, and they add their sticky notes when they've agreed on a starter, when they've agreed on a main course, and they present or lay it all out. Jamboard facilitates or is quite useful for early finishers as well. You know, that's a management issue. Some rooms will finish earlier than others, and you might get caught up in one room talking to people or helping them out, and another room might have finished early. So one thing I like to do is to have bonus tasks or bonus topics hidden away in case students finish early. So if they have laid out their feast, then they can just delete this, and then they have a couple of other things to do. Okay, what traditional music are you going to present at your banquet? What other traditional entertainment are you going to present at your banquet? And so on. I just went backwards and undid the deletion there, just using this here. So in the end, they present it to the other groups, and they choose their favorite or their most Hungarian or whatever nationality it is banquet. And here's an example of one that came up. If you have any notion of Hungarian food, you might recognize some of these things. If you don't, you won't. But that's the kind of thing you end up with, basically, at the end of the main task phase. They've worked on their own to brainstorm ideas. They've collaborated to share their views and opinions. They've decided on a feast, and then they've presented it to the other groups and voted or reacted to each other's somehow. But that still takes us to the language focus stage, which Neil mentioned in his cycle. And for that, I want to show you how I use Google Docs for a focus on emergent language, for instance. Can everyone see that I've changed from Jamboard to Google Docs? Can you see that? Okay.
Yes. Yes.
So thank you. Here's a template that I use. These are the notes that I've been taking as I'm paying attention to the task. So some of the things that I heard students say, but I didn't want to interrupt them. As we said earlier, feed in language if students ask you. That's great. That's teaching at the point of need. But there are probably going to be many things that you hear that you don't want to stop the flow of the task. You want to make a note of. So this is what I heard. And I want to end the language focus stage with better versions, what I would probably say. I'm not saying you were wrong, I am correct. That's too heavy-handed. Just this is what I heard. Here's a more natural way of saying it. Because sometimes language feedback is about upgrading. It's not about incorrect language as such. It's just different versions. So for instance, I might start the language feedback. Here are some of the things I have heard when I've done this task with learners. And I'll do a couple of examples with the students themselves. Now, don't get me wrong, I don't generally teach the phrase tripe stew to learners. It just so happens it came up in this task. So I don't know whether it has high surrender value for real life, but anyway, they wanted to talk about it. So I do a couple of examples with the learners, And then I say, if I have time, okay, get back into groups and look at the rest of them. Can you think of a more natural, more accurate way to say that in English? They get together in groups and they try and help each other to improve this language. And then by the end of feedback, we've got a record of some of the language that I've noticed and that I've given feedback on. The things that students didn't quite get right or weren't quite natural, and then how I might say it personally, even though there are different ways of saying it potentially.
There's even a nice use of direct translation there. I mean, why not, you know?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I mean, often you'll find, I mean, and obviously it sort of implies that you share the mother tongue of your students, which I do to an extent. And they might be asking questions, and so you can, in their own language, and you can exploit that too. An alternative, a different approach to language feedback, which Neil also mentioned or showed you in the framework earlier, is not just dealing with emergent language, but doing something called consciousness raising. This usually involves a text of some sort. So for this particular lesson, I created a text. This is a written transcript. It's actually an audio text on YouTube somewhere, in which I did a very brave thing, and I tried to justify British cuisine to my students. And I think I did a pretty good job sticking up for it. So this is my version of how I might talk about my cuisine. And they could process it for meaning. Okay, what it does, you know, does it sound as bad as you think British cuisine is? Is there anything here that's attractive? But the key thing with consciousness raising is then you guide them to notice language items in the input that may be useful for them in future. So what are some of the different phrases that are used to introduce the different food items? And I think I can see from my transcript, I say quite a lot, oh, I'd have to go for this, so I'm going to choose this. Oh, that's that one there. And there's a variety of different questions that draw their attention in different paragraphs to language that might be natural or useful. This is clearly this particular text, and these questions are B1, B2, rather than lower levels. So it is very nice to be able to introduce a text into the sequence in task-based learning, and often, oddly, after the task. So they look at it, they see an example of something similar or something relevant, and they're encouraged to notice language that might be useful in it. If it's new for your learners, you can't just say, okay, look at this text, find some useful language. They do need this guidance. They do need this scaffolding, the questions below, to help them notice language. But the more familiar your students get with this technique, as with any technique, they can sort of start underlining phrases themselves. Now, you may think, okay, that's all very well, but where does the text come from? Now, I love creating materials and I love creating texts. You can find texts online and so on and so forth, but Neil mentioned, and I'm sure you're probably already sick to death of the chatbot, right? But this ChatGPT is actually, for all it's scary, it's a wonderful resource for creating texts instantly. So this open AI. So this is something I did earlier today, very, very quickly. I said, what are some classic British dishes? It gave me a very quick answer instantly. It wasn't very informative. So I asked it, well, tell me about shepherd's pie. What is it and why is it delicious? And it gave me this text. There's a rather lovely text that has lovely language in it. That's the advantage of this OpenAI ChatGPT. It will create these texts instantly that are quite rich in fairly natural language. I've got plenty of reasons to criticize it, by the way, but that's not what I'm doing right now. And then I started talking about the sitcom Friends with it for some reason. Something to do with trifle. But anyway, if you're wondering, well, how do I create a text for students to notice language? You can use a tool like this to fairly quickly, efficiently, and instantly create it, assuming you can access it. It's been so overwhelmed by people trying to access that site that it's been hard. They seem to have upgraded the servers recently, so it's better. And it's still currently free as far as I'm aware, but I don't know if that's going to change. So Yeah.
It told me, whether you believe it or not, it told me that they were going to remain free for
That's what an AI would say.
So that's the end. I know that some of you have to go, but if you do have questions, we can take a few questions. This is the book from Delta Publishing. If you're interested, I think it has about 40 tasks in it with suggestions for language that can come up and access to the authentic recordings of people doing the tasks unscripted. Most of the tasks are for sort of intermediate upwards, but some of them can be done by A2 learners. And then there's the blog that Lizzie mentioned earlier on, has quite a few tasks on it, including some for young learners. And again, with accompanied by authentic texts as well, people doing the tasks. Thanks very much. And
well, if I can just do a quick extra plug, just very, very quickly. If you found the idea of task-based learning interesting, my workplace, Budapest Training Institute, you can see the symbol there, Euroexam International. Our task-based learning course starts next Tuesday, 24th, 5 o'clock to 7 o'clock Central European time, for 4 weeks, so 8 hours altogether for €60. Everything you want to know in 8 hours about task-based learning online. If it sounds interesting, email me at that email address or Google Euroexam International Task-Based Learning. And I get to do that course once, if I'm lucky, twice a year. So it's a very exciting event for me. Sorry about the plug, but there you go.
Brilliant. Niels, thank you so much. I'm going to have to go and do some housework now, and I'm quite depressed about that. Can you get me that? Can you get me your bot, please?
Yeah,
that'd be great. Thank you ever so much. That was
your chicken coop. Yes.
And yeah, my chicken coop needs a quick repaint. Thank you all for coming as well, and that was really great ideas and practical tips as well. I know that a lot of us are teaching online now, so using Jamboard is a great, and I learned some stuff about different groups and how it can be so interactive, and I love the ideas for bonus tasks, so really great. We do have a few minutes if anyone is around.
You're happy to take questions.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely.
Often people ask about low-level learners and what you can do with very low-level learners. And the answer to that is tasks that are mostly receptive, so that don't put too much demand on them to produce language. And like something that you probably all do already is getting them to follow directions on a map. Right? They listen to instructions and they follow directions. So that's a very typical task that you can do for low-level learners. They don't have to produce, they don't have to give the directions. They just
it's every inch a task as doing some complex problem solving. Yes. But it's suitable for low, because it's meaningful, it's meaning focused. They're having to follow a map or whatever it is that they're doing, or simply reacting to a text of some sort is a task. Yeah. And as I mentioned, things like listing, there are very simple tasks you can do very quickly. A task-based sequence can be 5 minutes. It doesn't have to be 45 minutes or 60 minutes. It can be very, very brief and form part of a lesson. You're not preoccupied with particular language. You just want to see how the students do with the language they have.
Yeah, really good points. There's a question here as well. How do you train students to use Jamboard for the first time?
Yeah, it's a really good question. It's like anything. It's sort of what's the nice way of putting it? Sort of breaking students into it. That doesn't sound very nice, does it? But gently, introducing them to it gently. So I would devote a portion of a lesson to it, that is language teaching, and in fact it's a task too. Let's get familiar with Jamboard. Here's one frame. Okay, has everyone got the link? Can you see it in the chat? Click it open. Give me a thumbs up if you can see it. You can't see it. It's in your browser. That's
a bit like
Google Chrome. Yeah,
that's a bit like
TBL. And then nice. put your name. Okay, here's the sticky note. This is what I've done. You model. Now put your name on it, etc., etc. And it's sort of a gradual gradually they get comfortable with it. So obviously don't be too ambitious the first time you use it. Just get them to put some sticky notes up, you know, and it works, and they're usually quite excited by it.